Hi guys, Elle here. These are all just random modern Fool cards, post-Rider-Waite-Smith Fool cards, by the way. Anyway, more and more lately, people are just fascinated by and talking about tarot history, like, all over the place. And I actually had plans to do this series a little bit later on down the line. I should have been working on my Six of Wands video today, but you know, my heart just would not have been in it. I have been so inspired by all you guys talking about tarot history in different ways, in different forms and stuff, but you know, whether it's on YouTube or on your guys' blogs, and it's just been really cool to see. I mean, tarot history is cool, you know, you like history, it's fun, I think it's important, but I think it's really interesting when you take all these old cards and all these old images and look at how they have evolved over the years, and look at each one in the context of the time from which it comes. And when you look at that and the different ways that the cards have evolved over time, you start to understand the tarot and each card in a whole new way. You start to add layers of meaning onto it, and that's what it's done for me. It's broadened my understanding of each card, looking at how it's evolved over time. Now, what didn't happen, and what hopefully will sort of illustrate throughout this video, is it doesn't just go from, hey, there's your Visconti Fool, all of a sudden you have the classic Marseille Fool, and bam, Rider-Waite Fool. I mean, there is just so much interesting stuff that happens in between here and here and here and here. But, you know, speaking of the Rider-Waite, you know, our classic sort of a Fool card, one of the things you notice when you look at most, if not all, of the Fool cards pre-Rider-Waite-Smith, basically, but especially these Renaissance Fools, like the Visconti Fool here, you notice a big difference. Like this card, the Visconti, is sort of rather depressing in comparison to what has become the standard, that and where you see things really change in modern tarot, because we've been brought up, you know, our tarot upbringing. When we look at this card, we see a neophyte, we see a happy dreamer, perhaps foolish but idealistic person. We see an image of the soul before its birth, of someone stepping out to begin their journey. You know, it's that untainted soul before its worldly experience. You know, we all kind of associate this idea of the soul before its descent into matter, before its fall into matter. And I think it's really interesting to look at pretty much all the cards that came before that moment in time. Because, you know, it might be a similar idea being expressed, but it's also very different. What you see here in these old Fool cards, and we'll talk more about it as we go through the different cards, but what you see is an already fallen man, or humanity, really, who's in their lowest state. You know, they've already fallen into matter, and now they are taking their first steps towards initiation, their first steps towards self-knowledge or evolution. That's why you get these almost depressing images of these historic fools as being like vulnerable and self-deluded. They're madmen, you know, they're jesters, they're carnival entertainers, and they're tricksters, and they're beggars, they're vacant-minded, and all those things. So yeah, there's differences, but at the same time, you can almost see both sides of that being expressed in one card, even if it is this image. I kind of like to look at both sides of that. I just think it's interesting. By the way, that is something specifically that Christine Payne Towler talks about in this book, The Underground Stream, Esoteric Tarot Revealed. It's about 20 pages in the book where she does what I want to do here with these videos and goes through the evolution of each card. I'm sort of using that as a guideline, and we'll be talking about other stuff that isn't included there, but I feel comfortable using it as a guide because it's actually also available for free on tarot.com. It's like an article up there, and I will post a link to it below so you guys can check it out. Okay, let's get this party started. I am not going to show you guys every single Fool card in my collection, don't worry. I am actually only going to go up to the Rider-Waite-Smith, basically, and if there's not a lot of change in the cards, in the card image, I'm not going to show you guys like a million Marseille images of the Fool that all look exactly identical. And also, for all you tarot history buffs out there, be warned, entire books have been written on this subject. There's a myriad websites, and there's endless forum threads on the tarot forums discussing the details of stuff like this. Like, I'm not going to get into the etymology of the Fool. It just gives me a headache, honestly. I'm also not going to talk a lot about the different types and categories of cards, the Milanese, the Ferraris, the Type A, the Type 1, if you guys are interested in that stuff, by all means, there's plenty of books, there's plenty of websites. But really, I just want this to be sort of a fun journey through the evolution of the Fool card. And this is, of course, the Visconti Sforza, the Piermont Morgan Bergamo, PMB for short, from about 1450, 1451. We actually don't have any other Fool cards from any other Visconti decks. This is, of course, the cleaned up version from Lo Scarabeo, and here is sort of a more accurate, this is what the card actually looks like. I printed this out, it's just on regular paper. But you can see, actually, if you have this deck, look at that, they've actually added what looks like he's standing on a precipice. He's standing on a cliff. Maybe that's there in the original, but it's sort of doubtful. Anyway, it's much easier to see things in this image, so I'm going to use this guy here. Anyway, he's clearly a lowly Fool, like we said. He does, however, still have a lot of the classic sort of attributes that we see in a lot of later Fool cards. His tattered clothing, his stockings, pants, socks, whatever they are, sort of falling down. He's even carrying a club or a stick or a wand or... and actually, if you look up here, sort of right there, you can see what most people say is a goiter. So besides being a penniless beggar, he's also sickly, Another attribute that you'll see kind of later, much later, is feathers in the hair. However, here he does have 7 feathers in his hair. He's also wearing all white, too. But the feathers in his hair... I've heard it said, it signifies a light mind, which I think is perfectly accurate and perfectly appropriate. However, I think overall, with the white and the feathers and the club, what you really get here is a personification of Lent. And this is a pretty common theory out there, and one that I totally wholeheartedly agree with. It's really, really interesting. So in the Renaissance, they would celebrate this period of time before Lent called Carnival, and it was like this hedonistic sort of party time. And it was followed by 7 weeks of Lent, 7 weeks of purification, 7 weeks of putrefaction, you could say, alchemically speaking. Easter Sunday is when the Lenten fast is broken. And what they would do, actually, with these personifications of Lent is they would actually pull 1 feather off of the head for every Lenten week that passed. And that's exactly what you see here, these 7 feathers in his hair. And actually, if you look at... There's some other stuff. I found this image online we're going to look at. There's our Fool we're looking at now. That is the Mantegna Fool we're going to look at in a second. But this is an image from, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Giotto. It's an image of folly, and it's from about 1300, 1305. But damn if that doesn't look exactly like this Fool also. And this Lenten persona. You can see the feathers in his hair, you can see the all white, you can see the club. Now this is a painting or whatever it is. It's not actually from a tarot deck, but you know, this image doesn't just sort of come from nowhere. When you put these things into the context of the time from which they came, it really adds, like I said, these layers of meaning. And this idea of this fool being the personification of Lent is just a perfect metaphor for the Fool card in general. You know, he's about to start down a path of purification. Next up we have the Tarot of Mantegna, sorry if I'm butchering the pronunciation, from about 1460, 1470. By the way, all of these dates are debatable. When you look these things up online, you will find a range of dates in different books and from different sources. None of this is an exact science, so I'm going with what I'm going with here. Also, the subject of what makes a tarot deck is a subject for another video. The Tarot of Mantegna really not being anything like what we consider a normal tarot deck. It does have 5 suits or 5 sections, but they're very, very different. Each one has 10 cards. It's a 50-card deck. This card in particular is called Misery or Misero, and it is the first card of the deck, and the first card in a section having to do with like the stages of man or something like that. The other ones have like the muses and the science. It's a fascinating deck. But what you see here is just so interesting with this Fool card. You see that little doggy down there biting at him. You see a scantily clad poor beggar man, basically. And he is actually even leaning on a stick. Here is another, it's the same image. It'd be a little bit easier to see what's going on here in this one. Isn't that amazing? He's wearing a loincloth here, just like you'll see in a lot of the cards to come, and just like you saw in the previous Visconti Fool. He doesn't have any feathers in his hair. He might not be a actual Lent personification or anything, but it still seems to be representing this very similar idea, this lowly man. He doesn't look like he has a goiter, but he does look injured. He looks sickly also, and like we said, this is where you first see our Fool being attacked by a dog. You get this idea that he is a wanderer, he is a stranger, he is a troubadour maybe, someone who goes from town to town, just wandering about, maybe an entertainer from town to town, or a musician from town to town. I've always liked the idea that this dog that attacks him is like a guard dog of whatever town he's in. He's protecting the people from this stranger. And I actually have one more deck to show you here that is not, oh, I gotta go for my bike there. That is not a tarot deck. This is actually a German deck called, let's see if I can say it, called Hafamterspiel. This is from about maybe 1450s, definitely mid 15th century though. And this deck, like I said, it's also not a tarot deck. It has 4 suits. I forget how many is in each suit, but each one starts with a Fool. And I've pulled the 2 male Fool cards here called Narr, which means in German fool. The other 2 are female Fools. They're really interesting to look at too if you want to take a peek at them online. But I thought it really cool to show you guys this here because this one is playing a bagpipe, which you will see in the Sola Busca Fool when we get to it. Didn't just come from nowhere, that Sola Busca. And this one, which is something you'll also see in some other Fool cards coming up, beating a drum or playing a flute. They're both sort of playing music. Isn't that interesting? This one looks very jester-like too, with his bells and his donkey ears, all that stuff you're going to see as we go through. And that's the Hafamterspiel. That is so fun to say, you guys. Okay, moving on to some cards you might be a little bit more familiar with. This one comes from the Charles VI deck. I've called it the Estensi deck. It's also called the one I can't pronounce, Gregonure, or whatever it is. This is a reproduction of it. It's been redrawn. But it is a friggin' fascinating Fool. You see those donkey ears again, those ass ears, because he's an ass. This fool is an ass. He was not held in high regard in those other decks, the Mantegna and the Hofamterspiel. Now I think I'm saying it wrong. You know, they represented the lowest state of man. And like we said at the beginning, it's this lowest state before you start back up the ladder. And this is from about 1465, 1470 maybe. And again, you see the loincloth. You see these donkey ears, these ass ears. He's like half dressed. He's barefoot. He's got this sort of dorky, dopey really look on his face. You see it. This is more of an original image of it. But you see that same sort of wonky look in his eyes. It's a little slow, maybe. And these children are like literally throwing stones at him. That's what's happening here. Because he's a madman. this stranger danger, maybe. And this next deck here, called the Desti deck, is from just a few years later, about maybe 1473, 75, something like that. And it's done in a very similar fashion to the previous deck, the Charles VI deck. It's from the same area, and it's made in the same way, commissioned by the ruling family of, what is it, Ferrara, I think? Where all the Visconti decks and stuff sort of come from Milan and that area, and were commissioned by the ruling family of that area. This is the same thing in Ferrara. And you actually have a very similar image. It's a little hard to tell. I printed this image out online. I don't think you can buy this in a deck, even though there are a whole bunch of cards that remain to this day. If you look like you're staring at a cock, basically, in the face, because that's because you are. His genitals are very much out and about, but you can see the children down there sort of poking fun at him, and actually, Christine Payne-Towler talks a little bit about this card in her book, and about how it's sort of representing maybe the vice, lust that leads to misery, kind of a thing. But you still get your classic fool, just like you did in the previous card, with the ears and the bell and the nakedness. His loincloth has been pulled down by the children. They're fucking with him, basically, just like they did in the other card when they were throwing stones. Just in case it's hard to see, I did print up a much bigger one if you want to see some full genitalia. There you go. This card is so interesting. It's a little pedophilia feeling, however, because this kid is definitely poking at the guy's ding-dong. It makes me giggle. But anyway, you know, this image shows our fool prey to lust with his arousal and everything, which really works for our fallen fool idea, too, that we keep seeing the same pattern repeated. And rounding out our cards from the 15th century, from about 1491, we have the Sola Busca. I love saying that one, too. Such an interesting card. Remember, in that German deck we showed before, you get a fool basically playing the bagpipes, which is exactly what you have here. I always wonder, I'm not sure if that's supposed to be like his they look like armor, so I'm not sure, but if that's supposed to be like his socks falling down a little bit, sort of reminiscent of the other cards. And his clothes here definitely are sort of draping anyway. He's got one shoulder bare here. But it really is a very different looking fool card, but I think this one, even still, the Sola Busca being such a radically different tarot deck than anything else from its time, and anything that comes later either. But you can still see a lot of these characteristics that we were talking about. It's almost like he's a wandering entertainer, a wandering it's almost like he's a wandering troubadour, a wandering musician, someone who travels around, like we've seen time and time again, and we will continue to see on into the 16th century. Here's a slightly brighter image of the Sola Busca too, just in case it was a little hard to see. This fool is numbered. I'm not going to get too much into the details of numbering and naming and things like that in this video. I think it is very important to have, in the Sola Busca deck, to have the cards numbered. It needed to happen, otherwise I don't think anybody, even at the time, would have had familiarity with what each card is supposed to be, because it's, it's just nothing like what else was around. I almost feel like the raven here is about to like pluck out one of his eyes, Is he looking into death itself? There's so much interesting stuff with the Sola Busca. Okay, on into the 16th century. Now, this card is from about 1500, but it's not necessarily a card. This actually comes from the Budapest Metropolitan Sheet, as it's called. Throughout these videos, I'll definitely be showing you guys some sheets, and what they are like printers, sheets. We don't have any of the cards that remain today, but we know that this was, a deck that was likely printed and in circulation at the time. Because we have some of these sheets that have survived. So not all the sheets have all the cards. You won't be seeing a fool from every sheet that is in existence, because they don't all have fools. Some of them, like the Cary Sheets, just have like the back half of the fool is all you can see. This is that Cary Sheets motto, that Cary Sheets fool that I said was only sort of a fragment that you could see, and that's it. That's all you can see of it. It looks like he's walking away. Maybe he has a backpack. Definitely has some sort of a staff, but it's hard to make out. This is the full Cary sheet. This one really is just the one sheet, I believe, and it is from about the same time, about 1500, give or take. But what's really, really cool about this, and we'll talk much more about these cards when we get to them, but you can actually see a Tower card and a Devil card, two cards that are almost always missing from really old decks. So this is a fascinating piece of history. But what you start to see here, I feel like, around the 16th century, and you'll see it more in the next few cards, is you start to get this really something we're more familiar with, this more jester-like looking fool, and I feel like you start to see it here for the first time. He's wearing a hat with a bell on it. I know it's really hard to see, guys. I'm trying to print it out as clear as possible. You also start to see something that looks a bit more Marseille, right? He's walking in profile. He has a wand here too. It's hard to tell what is actually on the wand. It almost looks like a cornstalk or a budding branch or something. In the next deck, we're going to talk about the anonymous Parisian tarot. You'll see this staff, this wand he sort of has, this walking stick, whatever it is, the club, as it was in some previous cards, turns into this, a stick with like a jester's head on it, that classic jester stick, like a puppet. But this is the Parisian deck, and it comes from about 1650, probably before 1650, actually. Let me zoom in on this guy for you. This is a very, very early Marseille style deck, although it comes from Paris. But you really start to see that standard jester look that you see in a lot of decks after this. He's definitely missing a lot of the classic Marseille attributes. There's no dog, he's not carrying a backpack, but he does have an outfit with lots of bells and whistles and tassels, and he's more of an entertainer here. But what you see is, just like in some of those previous cards where there were more musicians, they were more entertainers or performers almost. That's sort of the direction that this card goes, and sort of runs in that direction. Now that village idiot thing hasn't exactly faded away, although you don't see it as much in this particular card. There are still cards from around the same time, and I'll show you, that still get more at that. Up next, from around the same time, maybe early 1600s to 1650, somewhere in there, is the Tarot of Bologna. This is my Fine della Torre deck that has been nicely cleaned up and enhanced and everything. But again, right, you can see this entertainer fool, this performing fool, this wandering performer. And again, it looks just like that other German Narr image where he was playing the two instruments. Love that. He's still rather jester-like. Even his headpiece here reminds me of the Sola Busca. I just love the way certain Italian decks from like the Bologna region look. They have this amazing coloring to them. You'll see it in some other decks as we go. It's just so different than the standard woodblock sort of Terre de Marseille imagery that we're so used to. It's easy to forget that there's tarots like this and some of the previous ones we've looked at that are so different looking. Up next we have the Giuseppe Maria Mitelli deck, circa 1664. This is another deck from Bologna. And it's such a beautiful deck. It's more of a tarocchini. It's not a complete, not that it's not complete, but it's not a 78 card deck. But here again, you can see this sort of village idiot kind of fool, this lowly, tattered fool. The thing in his hand here that's sort of swinging in the wind with what looks like a balloon. A lot of that stuff you'll actually see in some later Italian tarots and Minchiatis. But yeah, he's only got one shoe and the one shoulder a thing again, like we've seen in some other cards already. The thing on his hat probably isn't a feather, but it does look very much like that Rider-Waite Smith sort of feather in his hat, doesn't it? Up next we have the Jacques Vieville tarot from Paris, about 1650. And around this time, you definitely start to see a more familiar image sort of coming together. This deck doesn't necessarily follow a traditional Marseille pattern. However, this deck from around the very same time, this is just a cleaned up version, a restoration, there we go, of the Jean Noblet, which is sort of considered like the first Marseille deck. But yeah, you sort of see a lot of the same things here in the two decks even. They both have that look to them, first of all, but they're both being attacked by dogs. We've got that going on now. Biting at him. In the Noblet, you can actually see the fool's genitals being exposed here again, just like they were back in the D'Este deck. And actually on the Noblet here, you can even see that sort of jester's head, that puppet head on the end of the stick or the staff. They're both carrying their bags in a specific way, just like you see in a lot of tarots, but they're still, the Noblet, the Vieville actually has that too there. You can see the puppet head on the end of his stick, just in a different spot. They both have bells on their outfits and tassels and things like that, but they are clearly travelers, wanderers, strangers, in exile, you could almost say. They're still sort of lowly, but at the same time they're entertainers, they're tricksters, they're jesters. Another feature that you actually see here too is that the dogs that are attacking them actually look way more cat-like, and you will definitely see that in like every single card. It almost looks like it's supposed to be a cat. However, in some of the old, like the Mantegna, you do see a dog. It's really actually very hard to tell what we are looking at here. Honestly, I guess in a way it doesn't even necessarily matter. Just an animal. In more modern decks, some obviously have clearly become dogs and some have clearly become cats. And rounding out our tour of the 1600s is another Bolognese deck that is clearly based on, like we saw before this, in the Parisian tarot, the Noblet, the Vieville, based on these sort of type 1 tarot de Marseille. It even retained the French title of the card, even though it was made in Bologna. Okay, so I'm going to jump around with the dates just a little bit as we head into the 18th century here, the 1700s. I just want to put these two cards sort of side by side. These are two Minchiati decks. This is the Minchiati Etruria, and this is the Minchiati a Lyon, Florence. And while they are both Minchiati decks, which are not your typical 78 card tarot decks, they very, very much still retain a lot of the classic major arcanas, including your sort of idiot-style fool cards here. Actually, if you take a good close look at the Minchiati Etruria here, you'll see that sort of the things that he's holding, the one fool's holding here, two people are holding them here. Sort of interesting kinds of wands. There's all sorts of theories about what those things are. I have not made up my mind. But you also clearly see in both of these images the children sort of making fun of the idiot or playing with him or messing with him, just like you saw in the two early Ferraris tarots, the d'Este and the Charles VI. This one, the Minchiari a Leon, is so cool because it's like he really does look like a jester who's sort of being messed with here with sort of a classic, more classical looking wand. And in the Etruria, he looks much more like the earlier sort of Mitelli style Bolognese fool. Or the misery kind of a fool, the very lowly beggar wearing rags kind of a thing. It almost even looks like he's got feathers in his hair, just like the Mitelli sort of reminded me of too. And the Etruria here dating to about 1725 with the Allione. I'm not sure the date on this one actually. The 1700s at some point. Oh, terrible. And I am going to jump back in time just a little bit to about 1709. This is the Pierre Madinay Tarot de Marseille. Here is where we really start seeing classic Marseille. There really isn't much change from the Pierre Madinay in 1709 to the Cosson, Francois Cosson. There it is. And was it 1736, and then the Conver in 1760. This is the deck, by the way, that Grimaud copied when they published in the 70s, when they published their Marseille deck, and that is why, and that became very popular, so that's why the Conver deck is sort of so popular too. But basically it is a copy of the 1736 Francois Cosson, almost exactly. You do see some differences in other decks from the time before the Cosson. It really started this pattern that sort of stayed almost exactly the same from the Cosson on. But some earlier decks, the Harry, the Madinay, all this other stuff is sort of from around the same time, and there's some really interesting subtle differences. Really the biggest difference you see when you look at these two cards compared to the Pierre, because I'm not going to say Madinay again because I'm sure I'm butchering it, is the coloring in the clothes. Look at that, it's very green and red, where this becomes more blue and red. But really they're all very, very similar. This is the classic Type 2 Marseille that we all know and love, with a dog pulling down the pants of the fool, attacking him. He's walking away, looking back behind. You even have sort of that awkward pose here, sort of where you know, the, what do you call that thing? The bag, his bag on a stick, should actually be really resting on the other shoulder. It's a very awkward sort of a pose he takes. But he really does look like a jester. He's got the bells on his outfit. You know, the silly hat, the silly shoes, the silly outfit, the walking stick and the bag, the beard, the looking over his shoulders, all the classic Marseille fool stuff. And, you know, the other thing that these Marseille fools do is they blend very well the village fool, or that sort of idiot fool, with the entertainer fool, where he's playing music or entertaining, or a troubadour of sorts. And if you look at it, it literally is both, both merged into one. But now you can see, when you look at the Tarot de Marseille image of the fool, sort of where it came from, how it got to be there. So where in all the previous Marseille Fool cards, we saw this merging of the jester and the vagabond, here in the Tarocco Siciliano, we actually have them sort of separated out into two cards. This is so interesting to me. They have a Fool card. That's the Fool card, but they also have a Miseria, misery card. Does that poor soul look familiar? And does that poor soul look familiar? I blew them up really big. This deck, I think this is sort of a nicely cleaned up version of it, but it comes from about 1750. You can still buy this deck. It's sort of a shortened, interesting little tarot deck. It doesn't have 78 cards, and there's quite a few differences. As you can tell, there are basically kind of two Fool cards, a Fool and a Misery card. And the Fool is actually numbered 0, and the Misery card is just unnumbered. Interesting little note, right? Anyway, moving on down the line, we get to, this is just a printout, but this is Court de Gebelin's image of the Fool from about 1781. Very classic Fool. Unless this has been flipped at some point, which I'm not too sure about actually, but he's actually walking in the opposite direction. Looks much more cat-like, but that's debatable on like every single card, right? But it's a very Marseille, you know, classic Fool jester vagabond hybrid, right? He's got his jester hat and his bells, his silly outfit, and being attacked, having his pants pulled down by an animal. Also late 1700s, you have your Etteilla, which actually, for an Etteilla card, is really very traditional, right? Look at that. Madness and bewilderment. What you do see is something really very cat-like again. He even has a bell on him, although he's not super jester-like. He's got a bell, he's a vagabond, he's a wanderer, a traveler, maybe a poor person. This sort of a cap you'll start to see more and more, this little red Phrygian type in some situations cap. Okay, next up is the Carolus Zoya. I'm actually showing this to you from the Marseille Tarot. It illustrates the pages of this book, but it's a great copy of it. Can I get closer? Anyway, this is the first Fool card that is sort of classified as a Piedmontese tarot. And I did want to take a second and show the Piedmont variant of the Fool card. This is an early example of a Piedmontese deck. So it actually does look very, very similar to the cards that we've just been looking at. It looks very much like the Marseille Fool. And in general, the Piedmontese tarots are very Marseille-based. Apparently, the Dodal, which is a Marseille from about 1701, was very popular in the region. And eventually, they just sort of evolved into their own unique sort of a system, the Piedmontese style of tarot, which is just, it's really interesting. So this is from about 1830, a little bit later, but this is an example of an early deck from Piedmont. That was the Gowalla. And these are two examples of decks made by Vergnano, like the printing company. I think this one's in Turin also. Most of them are printed in Turin, which is like the capital of Piedmont. But this one over here is an early example from about 1827, and this one from just a few years later, about 1835, 1845, something like that. And check that out. Those other few decks before this that I said were Piedmontese, if you look closely at them, you'll start to see all of these attributes sort of showing up in there. But this is kind of eventually what Piedmont tarot, or Piedmontese tarot, came to look like, at least on the Fool card anyway. I never see people talk about it, but I always feel like they have huge rear ends. This one in particular does not have a dog, although they sort of come and go, I feel like, in classic Piedmont decks. They always have this long red tassel. They always have a hat, very pointy, Phrygian style hat that's usually red with a visor. And holy shit, what is that, guys? That's a butterfly. The first time you see butterflies on Fool cards is in this Piedmontese style tarot. Yeah. Isn't that cool? This one happens to have a flower in it, but I don't think that's always the case. Actually, if you're really interested in learning more about decks from Piedmont, this variant of Marseille, really, check out what's her name? Check out Cheryl Smith at Tarot Heritage. The website by itself is just fantastic. Anyway, Tarot Heritage. But you could tell she's really fascinated by Piedmontese tarot. She even has a list on there of all the characteristics that are different from other decks that make the Piedmont, the decks from Piedmont, so interesting and unique. And there's a long history of tarot card making there. And anyway, the reason I wanted to go through a few of them was really to get to this amazing friggin' butterfly right here. It's also numbered 0, and there's just all sorts of cool shit going on here, right? Okay, so something we have not been talking about too much as we've gone through our Fool cards here is what's been going on in the world of, you know, tarot books, tarot writing, and basically starting with Etteilla. There's been lots and lots of occulty, tarot-y writing book stuff sort of going on. You know, you go from, there's lots of them, but, you know, you have your Etteilla, you have your Eliphas Levi, you have your Paul Christian, you have later Papus and Wirth, and, you know, all this amazing stuff being written about the tarot. And our Tarot Belin here, or Le Grand Tarot Belin, from about 1863 by Edmund Bilodeau, aka Magus Edmund, as I lovingly refer to him. Check out this freaking card here. It actually is so unique and so fascinating. I am obsessed with this deck right now. But it combines this very classic Marseille look, the entire deck does, and is based very, very heavily on how Paul Christian describes basically the tarot cards in his books. And now, it certainly also draws very heavily from Etteilla and from Levi. You see these Kabbalistic associations like he has, and a lot of Etteilla-looking imagery and descriptions and things like that. But this is the very first card ever in which you actually see an alligator on it. So now we have the butterfly, we have the alligator, we have the obelisk, we have the cat and the dog, and now we have so many of these things that we classically associate with the Fool, and we know where they come from and how they got there. This card is actually called the Crocodile, and the writing in French down there translates to all sorts of misfortunes threaten you. Here is nothing that you should fear, and your salvation can only come from the mercy of heaven. Oh, isn't that good? Don't you love this? Okay, moving on. Up next we have the Etteilla 3, or the Book of Thoth, and this is another Etteilla-style tarot based on the writings of Etteilla that came out about a century after these more original Etteilla images came out. And what you see here is really cool, actually, because it's that very classic jester. It's so interesting because you don't really see that in the earlier Etteilla images. He's more of that classic poor, lower class wandering beggar kind of image, whereas this one is way more of a court jester. He becomes the alchemist. He's called the alchemist here, and he's also doing something else I think is really interesting. He's covering his eyes. You know, he can't see where he's going. I feel like this deck may have hinted at that too, the Tarot Belin with his eyes almost shut there, squinting. But it's something you see later in those Egyptian-style cards that also sort of follow that Paul Christian way of doing things, where the Fool is actually blind or he has no eyes. And this is the first time I think that you really kind of see that, because he's covering his eyes. He can't see where he's going, which again I think is, you know, kind of reminiscent of this idea too, where he's looking up, about to walk off a cliff. You know, he's a blind fool. In a way, neither of them are actually blind in this image, but they both have no idea what the hell their feet are doing. A little bit later, in about 1889, you get your Wirth decks, which has a number of things like we just saw, the alligator and the obelisk, just like in his later deck from the 1920s, which is very similar. There's your gator and your obelisk. And again, in your Egyptian tarot, you get your gator and your obelisk, so wandering around the shards of these broken obelisks, still holding a staff. And here you can see on this card, he actually has no eyes, while all the other figures in this deck actually do have eyes. So he's like a blind fool here again, also called the crocodile. This specific deck, I think, is like from the 80s or something, and it's actually kind of hard to date this deck, but I'm going to go with about 1896, because that is when the book by, I'm trying to say his name, Falconer, came out with these specific images by Wegener, and all the imagery is very much based on the works of Paul Christian also. And as you can tell, this deck and decks like it were really influential on members of the Golden Dawn and their tarot decks. Okay, guys, and that more or less brings us up to the Rider-Waite-Smith almost. This is the Papus image. I just wanted to throw it in there, but it's really pretty traditional, more or less. You do get the cliff image and everything, but this comes out at around the same time as the Rider-Waite-Smith that we are also wonderfully familiar with. It's so beautiful. It still is darling, isn't it? There's all sorts of historic fools that we really didn't talk too much about. It's because they don't. Oh, I love the Neoclassico. Isn't that gorgeous? It's another big Chiadi fool. But they didn't really show too much evolution, so I left a bunch out. There's also so many, like, really cool modern fools. I love all the fools. Don't you love them? Okay. I'm exhausted. That was exhausting. That was really fun, though. Thanks so much for taking this magical little journey through the evolution of the Fool with me. And I will catch you next time, with the Magician. Woot woot. Thanks, guys. Bye. So friggin' pretty. Or I could just sit here for another hour and look at cards, because that's my favorite pastime. Look at, there's an alligator and a cat-dog hybrid and a flower. And he's dressed like a jester with a feather in his hair. Half-naked jester, cat, butterfly, alligator. Phrygian cap, cornstalk, bells. He's got bells. He's also got rabbit ears or donkey ears. This one looks like he has horns. He does have horns. That's the Tarot Esoterico. And that was the Stairs of Gold to Vaglione. I don't know if I'm going to put this in the video, but it's really fun. This is the Hermetic. Alligator, his bag, his staff, his rose, his flowers, his dog, his edge of the cliff. It's really interesting though, right? That's like the first time you see the edge of the cliff is in the Rider-Waite-Smith, right? Actually, they've included the bells in this one too. Isn't that neat? You don't actually see that on the Rider-Waite-Smith. That comes from older cards. This bells around the waist and bells on his outfit. You see it in the Etteilla. You see it on the Esoterico. He's got the bells attached to him. It just sort of was part of his jester outfit originally, and sort of evolved into, wearing a bell or something to indicate that, or a musical instrument. A little bit of both. Oh my god, guys, you know what I have to do now? Wish me luck. I gotta put all these cards away. Bye.